So as we continue with our conference, we have next up Gordon Ferguson. Gordon is definitely someone I admire a ton, and I'm looking forward to his talk, even though I have a general outline of some of the things that he will be sharing. So in 1996, when I was a young disciple and a member of the Boston Church of Christ, I had a chance to meet Gordon. He found out that I was on a mission team going to Africa. And since I had not been a Bible talk leader or held any position of leadership prior to that point, Gordon took some time to encourage me. He also gave me some cassettes. I know we remember those, and our Walkmans. Some of the cassettes include Refined by Fire, Romans, Justified, and so forth. I always remember Gordon's heart for God, his vulnerability, and his heart for people. And I'm sure we'll see more of that today. If I were to read Gordon's full biography, we would likely be here all day. However, perhaps his story is best encapsulated in his book, My Three Lives. I know when I grow up, I definitely want to be like Gordon. He's over 80 years old right now, and he's still going strong. And in my opinion, he is a prophet. And by that, I mean he is someone who speaks the truth regardless of the consequences. And I admire him a ton for that. Last Sunday, Gordon joined the Detroit Church of Christ Sunday School to teach about the impact of a lack of discipling on a church or a family of churches. Today in his lesson, Gordon will expand on some of those elements that he covered and help us live out discipling. Let's get back to being a discipling movement. Let's do it the right way. I give you my good friend, Gordon Ferguson.
Thank you, Otama. I really appreciate your friendship that we've had for a long, long time, as you said. And you've done a lot of work in the last several years, especially trying to just help churches grow and people grow individually. And I've been a part of that a few times, as have many others. And I appreciate all of your efforts. So I appreciate all the speakers. I appreciate all those who have tuned in. Thank you for doing that. I do think that the title of the series here that I'll be doing, or the lesson that I'll be doing, hopefully will not scare anyone off. If you'll stick that first slide up there, the power of discipling, I will get to that in a moment. But first, I have a confession to make. Since I've seen many of you in person, or you've seen me, I got old. Now, I know that because my wife told me that. A couple of years back, we were talking, and I said, you know, honey, we are in the old age category now. And she looked at me and she says, no, we're not old. And so I said, well, I'll be 80 years old my next birthday. She thought for a minute and then said, well, 80's old. And so I did reach that milestone a little over a year ago. And then my wife joined me the next year, but there I was, and she was celebrating my 80th birthday. And so then 1 year later, this last October, I moved up to 81. We're almost exactly a year apart, but she also hit the 80-year-old mark as well. And so we celebrated in a similar way with close friends and mostly all family. And so here is a picture that we took on her 80th of our son and his family. Our son, Brian, went out on the original church planting to Hawaii back in 1989. And after he got there, he wouldn't come home. He stayed over there for 25 years. He married Joy there, who is our daughter by marriage, as we call her. That's her mother next to her, who was converted while she still lived in Guam, where Joy was raised. And she's now living here in the Dallas area as well with her daughters. But then those are our three sons. They were almost grown when they got here, but we still enjoyed watching them go from the boyhood stage to the manhood stage. And so the oldest of them, Bryce, is 25. Blaze is 22 and Ronan is 18. And so we did get to see the last part of their boyhood before they became men. And that's how we ended up in Dallas, Texas. And a lot of people have asked about how we got here. And our family moving here in the middle of 2014 led to us moving here at the end of 2014. So we have been here now for 9 years. Okay, you can take those slides off for a minute and I'll get back to them a little bit later. But I am very thankful for the opportunity to be able to share with you. Those of you who know much about me know that I often teach and write about the topic of discipleship in both its vertical aspects and our commitment to Christ and in our horizontal aspects of what we call discipling. And so I've taught on it so long because it is essentially what drew me into this movement of churches back in the 1980s. The concept of discipling I call the missing ingredient from the mainstream churches of Christ that I was in. And I just recognized I need help. We all need help. We need to be in each other's lives in a way that we are not. And so I was very committed to that and got involved with the San Diego church back in 1985, had a wonderful experience there for about 2.5 years, and then moved to Boston. But the ones who have a negative view of the words discipling, you gained that view because we did some things wrong with the concept. And so I entitled it as the train going off the tracks. And let me explain that briefly to you. When I first met this movement of churches, it was essentially a campus ministry movement back in the 1970s and 80s. When I met the movement, the Crossroads Church of Christ in Gainesville, Florida was sort of the leading group. And so it was called the Crossroads Movement at that time. We've had a number of names and iterations, but that was the campus ministry time. And so the Crossroads Movement did a number of different things, small group Bible studies, soul talks, as they called them back then, that were very effective, and they were baptizing hundreds of people. But they also had a practice that they called prayer partner relationships. And so I asked Tom Brown about that. He was the one who introduced me to the group. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, we just pair off and have close personal spiritual friends that we get with and talk about our struggles and talk about our victories and about our dreams and all of that. It sounded great. And so there were prayer partners. However, by the time I got to Boston, that term had quit being used, and it was substituted with another term, discipleship partners. And I asked one time the leader of the Boston church and later the Boston movement, I asked him, you say that this movement started in 1979 here in Boston, but what about the Crossroads days? That's where you and so many other leaders were converted. So why do you say that the movement started in 1979? And he says, well, we've made 3 major changes. Number one, we don't have 2 commitment levels in our church. We have everyone on the same page trying to be biblical disciples. We don't have an old group that's not committed and a young group who is committed. That doesn't work. And so I thought to myself, well, I'm okay with that. That's a good one. Now, secondly, he talked about we plant churches. We don't just send a campus ministry group into an existing church because that led to a lot of problems in the early days. And so we just send out a church planting with all committed disciples. I thought, well, that's great too. I like that one. The third thing, though, he said that set them apart was that they didn't have just prayer partners. They had discipleship partners. Well, as I came to understand that once I was in Boston, that meant that it was an ordered relationship, one over another. That meant that it was an authority type relationship. And later I came to describe that as a military model. In my book, Dynamic Leadership, have a chapter, I think, on the military model of leadership. And that was basically what I found when I went to Boston, an ordered relationship in discipling, one having authority over the other. The whole concept of authority, we've got to understand. There are two basic types of authority. One is positional. That means if you're the captain in the army, you're over everyone in your company. And you have authority over them. You may be the worst guy in the group, but if you are the captain, you're in charge, you're the boss, etc. That's positional authority. And then you have what I call influence authority, and that has two components to it. Influence authority is, number one, relational in most cases. That means you have a relationship with someone. So you're going to trust the advice of a friend more than you're going to trust the advice of a stranger. And so relational authority is a part of that influence. The other part is knowledge or expertise. And so you go to a doctor, you don't know his life, you don't know much about him or her, but they are trained in medicine. They know more than you do. I just went to one Thursday. He knows more than I know. And so you go to them because of their knowledge or their expertise. And so in the church, our authority is primarily influence authority. That's the way it should be. Now, there is some positional authority involved, like a group decides, okay, we're going to meet on Sunday morning at 9:30 at this place, or whatever the case is. There are decisions like that that have to be made, and that's kind of a positional type of authority, but that should never be a singular person. I don't believe in that, except in some cases like a church planting or maybe a new campus ministry or something like that. If you only have one experienced person, then they are more or less in a positional authority situation, but they need to start building team leadership very quickly. Here in Dallas, we've had a change of leadership recently overall, and Mark and Connie Mancini are the congregational evangelist and women's leaders, and John and Barry Lusk have joined them pretty much in that role. And then we have a senior leadership group or senior staff group, and they also work with our 10 elder couples. And so they meet as a big group and they decide things. They have very collaborative leadership, and they make a point about that constantly. It's men and women together, and I think they're doing a great job. I'm very fired up about the leadership because we don't have a one-man show here. We have a group, a team who is leading together, and that's basically influence authority because they want relationships and they are involved and they want the pulse of the church, and they ask for all kinds of questions, have all kinds of meetings of different groups, all of that. That's all in my book, Dynamic Leadership, about how to build team leadership. But at any rate, we had that concept in Boston and later everywhere of the over and under discipling. Now, there are times, for example, if a staff person puts an intern on, a mature staff person, they are going to be mentoring that person. Then if you have an older Christian working with a new convert, teaching them to obey everything that Christ said, Matthew 28, then there's certainly a difference in maturity there that needs to be respected and honored. I understand that, but it is still a matter of influence authority because discipling relationships go both ways. When I first got to Boston, Wyndham and Jeannie Shaw were assigned the task of discipling Teresa and me. And so we had a relationship with them that was a wonderful relationship. Wyndham and I got along well. We had so many of the same interests and same backgrounds and all of that. But one day we took a walk around a lake. It was a pretty good sized lake, actually. And we ended up going around it twice because I talked to him about our relationship. And I talked to him about me confessing my sins freely to him, but he never talked about his struggles and his sins. And he says, well, that's not the way we do it. We confess that to the person discipling us, not to the one that we're discipling. That's that ordered business. And I said, no. relationships don't work like that. Friendships do not work like that. So we had this long, intense talk. It took 2 times around the lake until he bought in. The very next morning, he had a staff meeting with his group, and it was obvious he bought in. He said, guys, I really need you in my life. And I thought, whoa, that's kind of hard to say. It's easy to say, I love you. It's easy to say, we need each other. But I mean, he just said it. I need you in my life, all of you. And I thought to myself, that boy jumped a peg above me pretty fast on understanding that concept. And he was always like that. But that's the way it should be. And so discipling, the ordered relationship thing, especially the military model of it with this positional authority business, that is what caused us all of the problems in the early part of the century. At least that's when things rather blew up in the first part of the century. But it was building for a long time because those are not the kinds of relationships that the Bible describes. Now, I want to share with you some scriptures in a moment. We can go ahead and get the slides back up there, and I'll switch over to one in just a moment. But I want to know what God's word says about what we call discipling and why I am so sold on it and believe that we need it. It was the very thing, as I said, that drew me into this movement of churches. But there are some things we have to overcome, some mindsets that we have to overcome to really see the value of discipling relationships. For example, in Dallas, Texas, the common person's view of church service on Sunday is that this is the slice of the pie that God gets for the week. And so they go to church in order to have a vertical relationship with God. And so in their mind, this is their time of the week that they worship God. And so they go and they have this vertical relationship with God for an hour, hour and a half, and then they're out of there. They have very little to do most often with the other people in the church. They just go in, say hi to a few, shake a few hands, etc., and they're on their way. And then you add to that our Western mindset. And that is, we're very individualized. We don't think about us as a group nearly enough as some cultures do. We are very, very individualized. It's all about us as an individual. And so on the part about just having this worship time with God on Sunday, and you go in order to have that, and it's mainly about the vertical relationship, Romans 12 says, no, no, no. We offer our bodies as living sacrifices. Read the first part of Romans 12. And so that means that every day, all day, I am a disciple of Jesus and I have a worship. He calls it our spiritual worship. And so I worship God every day. It's not just confined to Sunday, but that's the mindset that most of the people have in the majority of churches. And then this Western mindset, we look at the Bible often in wrong ways. We misinterpret it. For example, in Philippians 2 and verse 12, he says, you've obeyed not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence. And then he says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And so I've heard many sermons on the fact that it's up to you. You've got to work out your personal salvation with fear and trembling as an individual. And that's the way it's preached. But that is not what it is saying. And that is certainly not the context of it. If you look at the early part of Philippians 2, it's all about counting others better than yourself and imitating Jesus in doing that. And so that's a wonderful concept there. But if you actually look at it, you see that the words, the pronouns are plural. When he uses the word you, Y-O-U, if you look at that in the King James, if you don't know the Greek, look at it in the King James. When it says ye, Y-E, that's plural. And so that verse itself is plural. But then you go on in the rest of the context, it's all about our relationships with each other and how they should work and how they should not work. And so the whole text of Philippians 2 is about a group effort to help each other go to heaven. It is not an individualized thing like most of us Westerners think. But let's just look at a few passages. There are 60-some passages in the New Testament that use the term each other or one another. And besides that, there are far more that describe the kind of relationships that we need to have with each other in the church. But 60-some times it uses those two phrases, each other or one another. Let me just look at a few of them to get an idea. He starts off in John 13:35, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Now, that's a pretty big recipe here for helping the world know that we belong to Jesus. And if you look at most of the one another, each other passages, it's all about loving each other and how to do that. For example, Romans 12 and verse 10, he said, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, honor one another above yourselves. Now, how are you going to do that without serious relationships where we are in each other's lives, we know each other, and we are devoted to each other? You've got to have relationships that are a lot deeper than most of us now have. I was preaching one time about the concept of discipling when I was still in the mainstream churches of Christ, and I went to a church that at that time was being led by one of the professors I'd had in biblical training, and I preached on it in his church. And he got up afterwards and he was very convicted about it. And he said, brothers and sisters, he said, all we do is we come up to church and we are in these shells. We put on our best face and our best clothes. We come up in these shells, and all that we do in relationships with each other is bump shells and go home. And I thought to myself, that's a pretty good way to describe what happens. We have a little chit chat with each other. We talk a little, but we don't spend much time talking about really serious things going on in our lives and what we need to be doing with God and what we are learning in the Bible and what we are trying to change, etc. Those kinds of conversations are not our normal conversations in a church building. And a lot of us don't have those kinds of conversations outside the church building to any appreciable degree. Going on down to Romans 15:14. I myself am convinced, my brothers, that you yourselves are full of goodness, complete in knowledge, and competent to instruct one another. I agree with what Kent McKean said last night. Sometimes we view the church too much as simply a hospital and everybody's sick. Well, we are all sinners, but we shouldn't be all sick. You know, there is such a thing as maturity in Christ. Paul said in Colossians 1, that's exactly what he strove with all his might to do, to present us mature in Christ. We do need to meet people where they are and help them, but the purpose of it is to get us strong and help us overcome the things that we can overcome, and discipling is a key component of that. I also like the mind change and metanoia method that the McKeans did. I actually went through that and outlined it in detailed form because I thought it was full of very good concepts. But he says that we are competent to counsel one another or instruct one another. But if we're not getting together and getting in each other's lives on a spiritual level and really helping each other, that is simply not going to happen. 1 Corinthians 1:10, I appeal to you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another, so that there may be no divisions among you, and that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. Now, there's a verse that we need right now in our country, in America, with elections coming up and all this stuff going on. There are too many of us that get all into what's happening in society and have more focus on that than they do our spiritual society, the family of God. And we've got divisions among us on some very minor things when you compare it to eternity. And I won't get off on that and preach more, but believe me, I can, and I have, and I will at some other time. But that's a one another passage. And we're to be united and not let a bunch of outside things, outside the spiritual realm with God, get us off track. Ephesians 4:2, be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. You don't need that passage unless you have a relationship, I mean a real one, with people. With most people at church that I see, I don't have to be patient with them. I mean, it's easy. I don't have any problems with them. I don't have to bear with them or be a bear with them, or they be one with me. We don't have that kind of relationship with the majority of people that I'm around, but there are some that we've got to learn to be humble and gentle with because we're in each other's lives. And we have to bear with each other because we know each other's sins. We know each other's nature, sinful nature. So that's a great passage that says relationships have to be deeper than most people conceive of in God's family. Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. If you don't have a true relationship, you don't have anything to forgive because you don't have any problems. You have a surface relationship. You don't ever get to the point that he's describing, and so many other passages are also describing. Ephesians 5:21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's an introduction to the family codes that Paul has in this section, as he talks about wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters. He introduces the whole submission concept of counting others better than self. It's a great, great passage. But submit to one another. Well, you have to have a relationship to do that. You have to be in a setting where that is going to be called for. You can't do that with shallow relationships of saying hi to each other and talking about the weather or the Cowboy game tomorrow or whatever else is going on the surface level. 1 Thessalonians 3:2, may the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other and for everyone else, just as ours does for you. So an ever-growing love that only can happen when you have a real relationship. Not just how do you do at church, but you have real relationships with people that are helping you grow and you are helping them grow. In Hebrews 3:13, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We're going to talk more about this one in a little bit with a few examples that are very important. But, we actually can encourage each other daily. I mean, we've got Zoom. We've got, I just switched to iPhone last year, but we've got FaceTime. We've got regular phone. We can talk with each other. We can see each other if we want to. We could do that every day. Now, back when this was written, people lived in a smaller area. They didn't drive everywhere in cars. They lived in a tight area, so they could see each other more often. And I'm not legalistic at all about every individual day, but I am saying that this passage leaves no doubt to the fact that we need encouragement regularly, because otherwise we get into sin. So obviously, the kind of encouragement he is talking about presupposes that we have relationships deep enough to keep us out of sin. And I'll get to an illustration, I think, that will help with that in just a moment. A few more. He says in Hebrews 10:24, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. That spur one another passage there, it uses a Greek term used only one other time in the New Testament, and that is when Paul and Barnabas had a sharp disagreement in the end of Acts 15. Now, I'm not saying we ought to go around spurring each other too hard or too often, but there are times when I need someone just to tell me the truth. And I can count some times when people have loved me enough to just look at me and say, hey, Gordon, let's get down to it, man. Come on. You can do better than that. What do you think God really would have you do? I appreciate so many talks where people have loved me enough to give me a spiritual challenge. They did it well. Now, have I had some give it the wrong way and rebuke me with something that didn't feel quite like love? Oh, yes, I've had those too. And some of them have ticked me off. But even some of them, as I got away, I got to thinking, they didn't do that right. Their manner was wrong, but doggone it, what they said was true, and I'll repent anyway. So I've had both kinds, but Paul is saying we need to be in each other's lives. Hebrews 10:25, let us not give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you say the day approaching. He's talking about our meetings together. People are missing. What do? You need to talk with them. You need to encourage them. You need to find out what's going on. Maybe they've got a real problem here you're unaware of and need to help with, but that's talking about our meetings together, guys. We don't talk to anyone. We used to talk to them in the wrong way, maybe. Maybe if they weren't there, we got on the phone and gave them a rebuke on the phone and said, get yourself up here, or some such stupid thing as that. I'm not encouraging anything like that. I'm just saying that when people that should be in the fellowship are not there, as a brother, I need to find out, how can I help? James 5:16, therefore confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. Now, all of those are great passages. You can take them down now. I'm done with those. But all those are great passages, guys. We need to be in each other's lives, okay? And I could multiply those all day long if I had the time or the inclination, but that's enough to show us why discipling is in the Bible and what it actually means and how it should be applied, at least some ways. But it is vital that we have spiritual relationships that call us higher, because in the end of the day, this is all about imitating Jesus. We're trying to get each other to be more like Jesus. As Otama uses his heading of image bearers, that's what we're called to be, is image bearers of Jesus. Jesus was the fullness of God. That is, he demonstrated in the flesh God's nature to people so they would know the real God and see him in the right way. The church is called the fullness of Christ. In flesh and blood, we reveal Jesus to people. We are maybe the only Bible they read to start with, but we are a living testimony of the scripture as we imitate Jesus. 1 John puts it this way, beginning in verse 3. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. And so it is all a matter of imitating Jesus and helping each other to do that. When I think of imitating Jesus, I think of three areas. There's some subpoints under them, but three areas. One, his character, his heart, his attitudes, his views of people, his views of God, all of that, his character. What is he really like? I need to be like him. I also need to imitate his relationships. How did he relate to people? I don't see him just hanging out with people. without a purpose. He loved them. He enjoyed hanging out with them, but he was always calling them higher. Now, he did that in a good way. He didn't overwhelm them. Just imagine being with God in the flesh, like the 12 were all the time. They were with him all the time, except when he was off praying. And so during that period of time, he knew every thought they had. You talk about some overwhelming discipling. Wow. He could have given it, but he didn't. Just a step at a time, baby steps. Let's keep growing. And so he was always calling them higher in a way that encouraged and helped them, not overwhelmed them. But if we're going to imitate Jesus, we've got to imitate his relationships and the fact that he was always into helping people be more than they were. He saw a rock in Cephas. He didn't see Cephas as Cephas saw himself. He saw him as Peter, the rock. He was always calling people higher. Day by day, he was in their lives, helping them to learn to imitate him, basically. And then his mission. He came to seek and to save the lost, Luke 19 and verse 10. And so that is a part of it. When I first got into this movement in San Diego, I had a brother who was a principal of a school. And he asked me, we had a discipling relationship, and he asked me, he said, bro, he said, how about calling me really early every morning before I go to work? And I want you to ask me two questions. Number one, what is your goal for today in evangelism? And number two, how did you do with your goal yesterday? Or maybe it was vice versa. But those were the two questions. He wanted me up at 5:30 in the morning on the phone with him. He asked me to do that. I didn't say a word to him about that, but he wanted me to do that. I said, okay, Jerry Jordan, that's what you want, bro. I'll get up earlier than I normally would, and we'll be on the phone at 5:30, and you can ask me the same question. And so we encouraged each other in our evangelism. It was nothing heavy about that. It was not beating each other over the head at all. It was trying to encourage each other's hearts to imitate Jesus, to seek and to save the lost. There's a right way and a wrong way to do discipling. But just because we did it in a wrong way in far too many cases in the hopefully distant past, that doesn't mean it's not a vital, necessary, essential part of being a disciple and imitating Jesus. We've got to focus on the positives as we encourage each other. But if we're going to imitate Jesus, we've got to also pay attention to staying away from the negatives to sin. That's what Hebrews 3 said, encouraging each other so that we were not deceived by sin's deceitfulness. One of the earliest definitions of discipling I heard hit me the hardest of any definition or description that I ever heard. I was in Gainesville visiting the Crossroads Church, and there was a brother there named Robert Nelson who had written a book that included a lot of things about the church there and their practices and all the flack that they were taking for it. But he had one section in there in which he said that discipling is God's way of protecting us from sin at the temptation level before it comes into our life and devastates us. I read that just before getting on a plane and flying back to Washington State, where I was still in the mainstream churches of Christ. And after thinking about that, I did not sleep for 3 days, literally. I'm not kidding. I couldn't sleep because I had a very close family member, a very close cousin that I'd grown up with. She was like a sister to me, my own flesh and blood sisters, 10 years younger, 10 and a half. But my cousin was like a sister to me. And she was involved in a church very much. Her husband wasn't at one time, but he had gotten baptized and he was very involved in this church, and they were doing great. And the whole family was so encouraged by his changes, just so excited. But my cousin was volunteering in a Christian school operated by the church where they were members. She was involved in this Christian school, and she developed a relationship that went way too far with the principal of the school. They ended up having an affair. Both of their mates wanted to work it out. They were willing to get counseling, I think, and did. But ultimately, my cousin and this guy divorced their mates, ripped up their families, married each other. It was a horrible situation in the family that did some irreparable damage. That had just happened when I read that definition of discipling. And I thought to myself, what if she had had a discipling relationship and she confessed the temptation, confessed it at the temptation level before it could blow up and destroy so much in our broad family and even in that church setting. And I thought of so many other people. If they had just been open at the temptation level, look what would have been avoided. I mean, that is a definition that I never forgot and that I need. I confess sin at the temptation level before it becomes full grown. I mean, that's what James 5 says, right? I mean, we've looked at the passage. That's what Hebrews 3 says. Now, what has happened to us without the discipling that we used to have? I'm not saying that we don't have some people in discipling relationships. I'm not saying that we don't have some people that are soaring on wings with eagles, because we do. God bless them. God bless you if you are one of them. But the majority of our people, I do not see the same kinds of growth and commitment in them that I saw in 1985 when I joined this family of churches. So what's happened to us? Well, individual growth. Failing to become more and more like Jesus on a continual basis. I mean, my wife and I, we're focused on that. I'm 81 years old. She's 80 years old. We haven't arrived, not even close. And so every day she's sitting over here in the corner listening to me, and she's shaking her head. Every day we are focused on how we can grow more in the image of Jesus. And so what we've ended up with in a lot of our churches is a large percentage of the work is done by a small minority of the membership. And that has led to burnout of our leaders for a lot of them. You got 90% of the work done by 20% of the people, or some such ratio of percentages. And then a lot of members that are frankly lukewarm have just come to enjoy a nice little comfortable church. That's what they want, a nice little comfortable church to go, not be challenged too much, but I want to go on Sunday and enjoy the worship. Hope the singing's good today. Hope the preacher doesn't preach too long. Sermonettes for Christianettes. And so we've gotten into that mode as churches in too many cases as well. So, but individual growth. Well, what about the Great Commission and church growth? One of the things that Atama read that impacted him a lot was some statistics that I had in my 3 lives. And so I wrote the book in 2016. So I said in 2015, our churches across the world grew in 2015 at a rate of 1.9%, just under 2%. The overall growth for the U.S. churches and Canadian churches at that time, that year, was only 1.3%. And so I had that and some other statistics in my book. By the way, that didn't go over too well with some of our older leaders. It's kind of hard to get your hand on those statistics, by the way. There are some leaders who have them. In fact, I saw one printout, and it says that these details are to be only kept among the leadership. I have a problem with that. I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but this is not the church of the leaders, okay? This is God's church, and this is the church of the people, the church of the disciples. And so statistics, to me, are things that can help us and motivate us to some degree. We need to be motivated if things are out of kilter. By the way, from 2000, Tom asked the other day, he said, I don't know the stats after 2015. Well, here they are, 2016 to 2018, just over 1% growth as a movement. 2019, 2020, just under 1% growth as a movement. 2021 and 22, minus 1.1% growth in 2021, minus 1.7% growth in 2022. So we're going in the wrong direction. We're in the minus category now. Many churches are, and we can blame the pandemic or whatever else, but there is a lost world out there. The UN estimates, this is right off the web, the UN estimates that around 385,000 babies are born every day, 140 million a year. Our family of churches is only a bit over 100,000 members across the world. You have 140 million people born every day. You had 61 million die last year. That's 167,000 every day. When I got into the movement, I believed we could change the world. We're going to plant churches all over the world. We actually did. We grew like crazy for some years. It was magnificent, and I'm so grateful for all of that. But guys, we need to understand what is happening here and get serious, because I don't think it'll work without what I am calling discipling. Unless we are growing individually, we're not going to grow collectively. And we need to know what is really happening. Stats are not bad. If you are using that pridefully to say, well, my church did this or our movement did this in a prideful way, well, no wonder you're not going to like to share those stats when we're not going in the right direction, if that's what you've used it for. But stats are good. It helps you evaluate and take some steps to improve things. I was on line yesterday looking at my bank account, trying to figure out a few things there to make sure I'm doing things the right way and my bills are paid, etc. I don't do it all the time, but I've got very good credit. It's over 800. So I've got very good credit because I know what's going on with my finances. I stay on top of it, but I can't do that if I don't know what they are. I went to the doctor Thursday. I have not been watching my diet. I've been under a lot of stress in 2023. Funny thing, probably more than 2022 when I spent 23 days in the hospital and almost died. But for some reason, 2023, and I know the reasons, was pretty stressful, at least the last part of it. And so I was stress eating, and I knew my stats were not going to be good. And I saw them pop up yesterday from my health portal, and I looked at them, and yep, just a tad over on my H1C. I'm barely in the pre-diabetic range, and I can fix it if I eat right. I've got some kidney function issues. I knew they'd probably be a little off, and they were a little off. They've been that way 25 years, by the way, and I know how to deal with them. I'm not overly concerned, but I stay up with that stuff. I want my body to be healthy. Why wouldn't I stay up with what is going on with me and with our churches statistically? Why wouldn't I want to stay up with that? So I would know what needs to be addressed. Well, anyway, I could say more about that. I probably need to shut up now. I'll get phone calls from this one anyway, but that'll be fine. Now, what can be done about it? I've got 10 minutes left. Some difficult decisions are going to have to be made. We have moved from a focus on individual relationships to sort of imitating the evangelical world and focusing on Sundays. I can tell you historically when that happened, how that happened in our movement of churches. I don't have time to do it now, but I can give you the date and the place and tell you exactly how we started being like that about Sundays. But now It became all about Sundays, having a great worship service, wonderful music, all those things, which being a musician by background and training early on, I love all that. But that's not what church is all about. Sunday services and making it so that becomes our focal point spiritually. No, sir, that is not what I read in the Bible. But we focused on that. And so friendships remained, but not what we're talking about. There was less and less emphasis on being in each other's lives. And then COVID hit. And so we went to virtual services, which I really appreciated, by the way. I think so many churches did a great job. I really appreciated the Dallas church. I mean, we saw some great virtual services that were really helpful in a time when we had to be isolated. I appreciate those. I'm not down on those. But when we started meeting together again, we found out that a lot of people had gotten a little too comfortable going to church in their pajamas. And so getting back together, I mean, if we could just get people to come to church on Sundays, we felt good. But we know that our midweeks and other meetings are not functioning in the way that they should. If your church is different than that, God bless you. But we're going to have to do something to get the church involved in each other's lives and therefore be a church like I think the Bible is calling us to do. I've been preaching for a long time that no organization can function without understood structure, without an understanding of expectations, and without accountability. All of that can be done right, and all of it can be done wrong. And the fact that it's been done wrong in too many cases does not eliminate the need for those three things. We celebrate our 59th wedding anniversary on the 30th of this month. We have structure to help our marriage keep growing. We have expectations. My wife especially has expectations. And brother, there will be accountability if we're not doing what we've agreed to do to keep our marriage strong and healthy and growing and exciting. You've got to have those elements. We're going to have leaders to lovingly lead us back to the kinds of relationships and individual commitments that we read about in the Bible. We get fearful. We're afraid if we start asking too much of our people, whether the Bible asks it or not. If we ask too much of our people, we're afraid we're going to lose more members. And then that's going to make us look bad, and maybe we can't meet our budget, and we can't support all the things that we have undertaken financially. I understand that fear. I really, really do. But we're going to have a bigger faith. We're going to have a bigger commitment to the Bible and what it says about being true disciples as defined by Jesus himself. This is our church. As I said earlier, it's not the church of the leaders. It's all of our church. We're in it together. We are the family of God. Whether the leaders step it up or not in some of the ways that I think they need to, we individually have to do what we can do. We need a grassroots growth among us. We need a grassroots movement that says, okay, we're going to have some discipling around here. We're going to have a group. We're going to have a threesome. We're going to have a twosome. We're going to get together. We're going to talk about our lives. We're going to deal with sin at the temptation level. We're going to talk about the mission and about the nature of Christ and how we need to be his fullness and reflect him and to be image bearers. All of those things, we can start at the grassroots level and just flat get that going. It can happen. It has happened before, and we need to do it. Leaders, you have a responsibility that's bigger, and you need to take care to do it. Do it the right way. But guys, we've got to be called and call each other, from the leaders and all the rest of us. We've got to call each other higher to imitate Jesus and be the church that's described in the Bible. and have the kind of relationships that's described in the Bible, what I am calling discipling relationships. As my good brother Carrillo said last night, we are in a post-Christian America. It's going to heat up. In the Bible Belt, it'll take longer where I live, but it is going to heat up, and there is going to be persecution, and we're going to find out who really has a commitment that will take them through anything that comes their way. The challenge is going to come. The persecution is going to come. And I really believe, guys, with all my heart, that the only ones of us that are going to ultimately make it when it really gets challenging, and it is going to, predictably, without question, in my judgment, when the challenges really come, the only ones of us that are going to make it through are the ones that are invested in discipling and helping each other become more and more like Jesus. He said we've got to deny ourselves, take up our cross daily, and follow him. And I cannot do that alone. I must have help. And I am grateful for the people in my life that have changed my life. God has used them as his vessels and his tools. I am forever grateful to them. And I am grateful for all those that are in my life now that are calling me higher and helping me to be a better version of me than I am, as I try to become a better image bearer of Jesus. And discipling at that level is what will make us at a church level and a movement level what God is calling us to be. It cannot remain a missing ingredient in many of our lives and many of our churches. It is God's plan to help us grow individually and collectively. The power of discipling. That's my lesson.